All right, everybody. We are back for section 1 of our new research methods course. I hope you watched the little introduction I just filmed. Um, but here's where we're going to learn all about science, the scientific process, and how you can be both a good producer and consumer of research and science. So we're going to begin by asking questions, right? Um, I know it annoys a lot of people, but I love it when like 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds just cannot stop asking questions, you know? Oh, why is the sky blue? Why is that car doing that? Why is he dressed that way? I love that youthful desire and curiosity about the world that's so strong they just can't help but ask question after question after question. And it saddens me that as adults we kind of get out of that habit. But we all, even if we're adults and we've grown out of our 3 and 4-year-old constant question asking stage, we still ask questions, right? Um, just all the time. You know, why do people commit crime? Why is he wearing a red shirt, not a blue shirt? Um, did that TV show get canceled? Why isn't my favorite music act not coming to my city and instead going to this other city 10 hours away? We're constantly asking these questions, right? And if we want an answer, we need to make sure we're using the proper process to get an answer that most accurately reflects the truth with a capital T, right? The real world, measurable, factual information that we can use to answer that question to the best of our ability. Sometimes we don't have enough facts and information to answer a question, and there's, just not enough out there to really give a good, solid, simple answer. Such as, why do people commit crime? There are lots of theories out there, which you can learn more about if you take my criminology course. Some of them have more evidence than others, but there has not been one theory that people or researchers have chosen as, oh, this is clearly the answer to why people commit crime, right? But we have all these questions. We're all wanting to know the answers for all these things, and most of us just kind of give up on it, right? One of the things I ask myself as a teacher is, how are the students in my class going to perform? The first week of class, I am curious how well each one of these students in my classes will perform. And I could look at, say, their grades in previous courses. That would give me a pretty good idea of how they will perform in my current course. Not going to be perfect. Just because you've earned all A's so far doesn't necessarily mean you're going to earn an A in this current class. And just because you've earned C's and D's before doesn't mean you're not going to earn an A in this class. But it helps me get closer to an accurate prediction, right? Disturbingly and distressingly, some of the best information about how a student is going to perform in my class are things like, where are they sitting in the room? Obviously, this only counts for seated classes, not online courses. But students who tend to sit more towards the front, in general, perform better than students that tend to sit towards the back. So knowing where they're sitting in the room can help me get an accurate prediction of what kind of grade they're going to get in the class. I could also ask them the zip code that they grew up in. And that would provide a disturbingly accurate prediction of not just how they'll perform in my class, but whether they're likely to graduate or not, whether they're likely to get a good job after graduation or not. So there are all kinds of information we can gather in lots of different ways to help answer all of the different questions that we have on a daily basis. Lots of times we can answer questions just based on what we already know. But how do we know stuff? Like, I know that Diet Coke tastes delicious. At least I think Diet Coke tastes delicious. How do I know that? Well, for me, it's through personal experience, right? Many, many years ago when I was very young, I tried Diet Coke for the first time, and I found out what it tastes like. And now I have that personal experience that tells me that if I drink another Diet Coke, I will enjoy the taste, right? But also, if I hold up my cell phone and then drop it, what direction will it just hang there? Will it go up? Will it go down? Will it go sideways? I know that it will fall to the ground, again, through personal experience, but I also know exactly how fast it will accelerate towards the ground thanks to early physics researchers, right? I know that that cell phone will fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second, completely regardless of how much it weighs, or disregarding air resistance, what shape it is, right? That information that I know it will fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared, that is irrespective of its weight, is something I know because earlier researchers did a scientific evaluation of falling objects, right? Maybe my mother told me when I was very young that the noise in the trees at night was invisible monkeys. Well, that's not really true, but I might still believe it anyway, just because my mother told me, a person of authority said something, and I'm going to believe it, right? So there's lots of different ways we can learn stuff, from research to personal experience to being told by some authority figure to tradition to all kinds of things. But the problem is there are lots of different errors in human reasoning that cause us to believe things that just aren't true. It's really, really, really common for people to know things that just do not accurately reflect the real world. They aren't true beliefs, right? So first we need to make a very explicit distinction between science and pseudoscience, right? Science is a process that relies on research. It relies on measurability and repeatability. It relies on experiments of multiple different kinds. And science changes with new information, right? The field of, pick a field, but just randomly, the field of physics today believes much different things than the field of physics 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or 100 years ago. Because science is constantly changing with new information, right? Whereas pseudoscience uses a lot of the kind of dressing of regular science. It attempts to use a lot of the same language, but it's not reliant on evidence or the scientific process. It's reliant on things like anecdotes, i.e. personal experience, right? And that's not the same thing. And a very similar distinction we need to make is the difference between skepticism and denialism. Skepticism is good. We should all be skeptics. We should all be skeptics. If anybody ever makes a claim, like your mother saying that the noise in the trees at night is invisible monkeys, we should be skeptical of that. We should want evidence. Skeptics always want evidence, right? And they will not believe something until they are provided good, factual, scientific research as the answer. Denialism is similar but distinctly different, because with denialism, that's when you believe something or refuse to believe something despite the evidence, right? So global warming is happening, and it is primarily driven by human activity. There is tons and tons and tons of evidence out there that all comes to that conclusion. If you are denying that global warming is happening and is primarily driven by human activity, despite the evidence, you're not being a skeptic, you're being a denialist. You're rejecting the mountain of scientific evidence that has convinced all of the relevant scientists in the field, and using one of the many logical or errors in reasoning that we're about to discuss, because you don't want to believe that science. So that's not skepticism, that's denialism. Skepticism is wanting evidence. Denialism is rejecting evidence. Okay? So we understand the distinction there? Okay. So what are the different errors in reasoning that make science so important? Because we all do these, myself included. Every single person watching this, everybody that's not watching this, again, myself and my loved ones included, we all have these errors in reasoning that we use commonly, some more than others in this area and some more than others in that area, but we all do it, right? And there's lots of different ways we can talk about these errors in reasoning. So, one set of errors in reasoning we can talk about are things like overgeneralization, right? So we know something is true, say, about one member of a group, and thus we believe it's true about every member of that group, right? So let's say I happen to know a woman who is a terrible driver. And instead of just believing that that one individual is a terrible driver, I might let that kind of guide me to believe that all women are terrible drivers. When in reality, I only have experience with one or two women that are terrible drivers, right? So I'm overgeneralizing, right? Or, everybody I know is really going to vote this way in November, thus I predict that team will win. Well, you're talking about hundreds of millions of people in the United States that are going to vote, and you only know maybe a few hundred, and you're trying to say that those few hundred that you personally know are voting one way so that the whole nation of hundreds of millions is going to vote that way? That's an overgeneralization. There's selective or inaccurate observation. This is where we have an idea and we only see instances around us happening that confirm that idea, and we don't see or don't remember the instances and evidence that go against it, right? So if you're a fan of team sports, right, you can watch a game and say, oh, clearly the other side committed more penalties that weren't called by the referees. But the fans of the other team are going to watch that same game and say that the team you're cheering for clearly committed more penalties that weren't called by the referees. Because we're only observing the ones, our brains are only taking note of the ones that conform to our beliefs and kind of not seeing the ones that don't. If we believe women are bad drivers, we're only going to see the gender of a driver who we see driving badly when it's a woman. Because that's what our brains are only going to point those out to us, right? It's like the old game some of you may have played as a kid, the slug bug. Whenever you see a Volkswagen bug, you punch your brother or sister in the arm, say slug bug, right? This is a stupid thing back when I was a child. But once you start looking for something like Volkswagen Beetles, you start seeing more and more and more of them. Because they're in your head, because you're looking for them, you will see them. And when you're not looking for them, you don't see, right? Then there's illogical reasoning, right? And illogical reasoning is kind of a really wide catch-all term. but it can be something relatively simple or relatively complicated. One I heard a comedian say many years ago that I always really liked was God is love, right? We all know that. We've heard that from many, many different religions all over the place. And we know love is blind, right? That's something that is said a lot. Love is blind. So by that logic, clearly Ray Charles is God, right? Well, no. It has kind of a reasoning and a path in it, but that's illogical reasoning. We're coming to a conclusion there that's not necessarily justified by the evidence, right? So something like, oh, it's cold outside today, thus clearly global warming's not happening. That's illogical reasoning, right? Another thing we have to be careful of is resistance to change. People hate changing their minds about anything. Once they start believing one thing, it is nigh on impossible to get them to change how they think or what they believe, right? Some of that is ego-based, i.e., I don't want to admit I was wrong. I know I'm right, and darn it, if I was wrong about that, I could be wrong about other things, and I'm not going to admit that I'm wrong. There's just, the sense of tradition, right? We nigh on fetishize tradition in a lot of sectors of life, where we have to do it this way because that's how my father did it and how his father did it and how his father did it. And so we have to do that and believe that and think that because it's worked for them. And then, of course, there's authority, right? Well, the leader of my political party said it, so I believe it. Or the Pope said it. Religious leader says this thing. Or my father told me. Or, and trying to change that belief after these authority figures have tried to tell you something is very, very, very difficult. Now, in the field of philosophy and logic, there are a whole bunch of these things called logical fallacies. And exactly how they're grouped and exactly what they're called varies slightly. And this isn't a logic course, so I'm going to go through a few of these. But you might see a different list in another list of logical fallacies, or they might be called something slightly different. But some of my favorite ones are things like the slippery slope, right? If this thing happens, then obviously it's going to keep going until it's this giant, massive problem, right? If we allow gay people to marry, what's next? People marrying turtles, which was a real argument back 20 or 30 years ago. If we allow, or if we take away automatic weapons, next thing you know, nobody's going to be able to own a gun at all, right? Those are all slippery slopes. If we go this far, then clearly the result will be way further, right? Another kind of a classic one in here is the ad hominem, right? And this is one that gets kind of misused a lot, right? Especially on social media. But the ad hominem attack is basically saying you're wrong because you're an idiot, right? So there's somebody out there, we think they're an idiot, they say something, we say, oh, clearly he's wrong about that thing, he's an idiot, right? That's an ad hominem attack. It's not, how it gets misused on social media a lot is when people say, oh, you're calling me an idiot, that's an ad hominem attack. No, an ad hominem attack is when somebody says you're wrong because you're an idiot. If they say, hey, you're wrong, here's a bunch of evidence as to why you're wrong, also you're an idiot, that's not an ad hominem attack. Okay? The appeal to emotion fallacy, right? This is where we say, oh, but if that were true, that would make me really sad. Well, that's not, we need to pass this certain law because it will save children's lives, and here's a picture of a child, and don't you just love this child, and isn't this the most beautiful little baby you've ever seen? that's not an actual reason to pass that law. That's just an appeal to emotion, right? And then another one on here, the black or white fallacy. This is also the false dichotomy, right? Your choices are either A or B, when in reality there's lots and lots of different choices there. Sometimes there really is only a choice between A and B. But a lot of times there's tons of other choices, and people will kind of make it seem like it's either A or B. Like, either you pass a law about abortion or you love killing babies. Either you want to reduce taxes on the rich or you're a socialist. No, there's tons and tons of other options in there. Those aren't the only two choices, right? So framing something as having to choose between two when there is clearly viable alternatives other than those two is the false dichotomy or black and white fallacy, as this thing does. Some other types of biases that we have to be kind of worried about. One of the biggest and most impactful, especially in the 21st century, is confirmation bias, right? We only listen to sources that agree with us. So if we vote for a certain political party, we're only going to watch news media that supports that political party. If we really believe strongly about some social movement, we're only going to hang out with other people who agree with us about that social movement, right? But that's not that, we're kind of creating these bubbles that really only reflect sometimes a very small percentage of how people think and what people believe and what people are, news media that's kind of cutting out all other opinions and priorities and all those things. There is a recency bias where we tend to remember best and think about most the things that we have learned or heard or seen recently, right? And you can see this with TV commercials. In TV commercials, the last commercial before a show comes back on is usually the most expensive one, because that's the one that people are going to remember the best, right? Probably my favorite is the placebo effect. We're going to talk more about the placebo effect later in this course, but this is one of my favorites because the placebo effect is one of the most powerful forces known to humanity. And it comes from the fact that in medicine, you can give somebody a pill and tell them, oh, this will cure your headache. And even though it's like the pill literally has 0 active ingredients, it's just a nothing pill, many people will report that their headache just got better because they believed that the pill would help their headache actually will go away, right? And the placebo effect is incredibly powerful. For instance, 2 of these fake pills will be more impactful than 1 fake pill at curing headaches or making making people feel better. It's one of the most interesting tiny little subsets of science is how the human brain is capable, if it believes something hard enough, of literally changing reality almost, right? And when people say that their headache got better, when they say that this placebo, when this nothing pill actually had an effect, they're not lying. It might have really had an effect, but it wasn't due to the ingredients in the pill or whatever other placebo people are getting. It's real, but it's entirely due to their brain believing it, right? So a lot of the kind of pseudoscientific health products out there, they'll promise, oh, you take this pill, or you do this diet, or you cut this ingredient out from your cooking or whatever, and all of a sudden you're gonna feel better and you're gonna have more energy and all those things. The vast, vast, vast majority of those are just the placebo effect. People do the diet, or they, drink this special shake, or they take the pill, or they do the certain exercise that is not evidence backed, and they really do feel better, right? But it's not because of anything that the thing they actually did accomplished. It's just their brain believing it should get better, so it does. And then another one of my favorites is survivorship bias, right? I love seeing, certain memes on social media that say, like, oh, back in the 70s, I used to ride a bike without a helmet, and ride in the back of pickup trucks without a seatbelt, and, I did all these crazy things, and I ended up fine. Well, of course you did. The people who didn't end up fine aren't alive to be able to post on social media. You're not going to find people who say, oh, I rode in the back of a pickup truck and I wasn't fine because, we got in a wreck and I was thrown out and died with my head hitting the pavement, because they're dead. They're no longer available to provide their differing experience, right? So if you only focus on the examples you have that still are around to provide examples, without looking at all of the instances of that same thing happening where they didn't continue on, whether it's because they died, or a machine broke down, or they dropped out of a study, or whatever. But if they didn't survive to reach the end to provide their examples, you might have a vastly distorted view of what happened and how and why, right? So, in science, our job is to recognize all these errors in reasonings, whether it's overgeneralization, or false dichotomies, or survivorship bias, or whatever. We need to identify them, understand them, and then minimize them. I would love to say get rid of them completely, but that's impossible. It's impossible to 100% get rid of all biases and errors in reasoning, because we're human. But if we can identify them and locate them and understand them, we can absolutely minimize them. And that is going to help us get a much clearer picture of reality and what's actually going on and facts than any other method humanity has found so far, right? But why? Why do we want to get this? Why do we want to understand the world a little bit better? Why do we need to do this scientific process? Why do we need to figure out what the world is like around us? Why do we need to participate in this process of science? Well, there's not an infinite number of these reasons, but three of the biggest ones are: one, policy. We need to set laws. We need to set, engineering standards. We need to do all kinds of interaction, whether it's through government or by private companies, or, Boeing making airplanes, satellite companies launching a new weather satellite, setting criminal law, right? These policymakers hopefully are going to pay attention to what scientists say about the subject they're trying to create policy about, right? They don't always, unfortunately, but they should. And we need to help guide that policy with the best understanding of reality we can find. Second, there's academic, right? It's very rare that one researcher will create a giant leap in knowledge, right? The vast majority of research, and I mean, I would argue all of research, is just one more tiny little step. 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 So as scientists, our job is not to become the next Einstein and create this big giant leap. Our job is to push just a tiny little step. And it's through the collection of all those tiny little steps that we get these huge, gigantic developments, right? So back when Einstein created his theory of relativity, there was no real practical impact. There was no real practical way to use his theory at the time. But now, we couldn't have GPS without it, right? You know, your global positioning system, where your cell phone can tell you how to get from here to the grocery store, that wouldn't work without Einstein's theory of relativity. So even though something might seem like, oh, we're only doing this to advance academic science and there's no real world impact to this, yet we don't know how this is going to affect the future. We don't know whether our little step is going to be needed for this little step way down the chain that's going to save millions of lives. You don't know. And then, of course, there's personal reasons, right? What we choose to study and why we choose to investigate things might have something to do with our personal lives. I've heard lots of stories of people in the medical field saying, oh, when I was a kid, my mother or my father or my grandfather or my aunt or my uncle or whatever were really sick. And I had to go to the hospital all the time and see them. And I decided then and there that I was going to go into medical research and try to make what happened to my mother or father or whatever, make sure that never happened to anybody again. So now lots of scientists studying specific things are there doing that because somebody they know and love was impacted by that thing. Whether it's cancer or violent crime or whatever, right? So just what happens in your personal life, especially when you're young, can really guide what you want to research and how you want to research and why you think it's important and all those things. So, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you so much for watching.